Hello, people. Hi, guys. We just finished our webinar, and now we're moving on to the questions that we didn't get to. I know I ramble. There's just a lot to talk about, so I will forgive myself. But here we go. Let's dig into the questions you guys so kindly asked. By the way, thank you. It was a really joy for us on this end to just feel like we're participating in something. And for the subsequent ones, yeah, I'll try to spend more time, give more space and time for each of us to respond to each other too. That's where we want to go. So anyway, let's jump into your questions. Sonia, you want to read us?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the follow-up questions we had was, can you talk about culture's inclination to deem the caregiver as amazing and the patient as amazing, to marvel at the ability to continue to live? As an active caregiver for 7+ years for my husband, these comments made me feel, and him, like more of an outsider. It's rare to find deep listening. It seems like it's either pity or being seen as a superhero.
I really resonate with this question comment. Thank you. As someone who has a mother who's lived with a disability my whole life and most of hers, and then as someone who's become physically disabled myself, I'm very used to these projections, is that I'm like either Frankenstein or I'm some sort of Christ figure. It's really, and of course I'm neither. Your point is your point is really, really well taken. What to do about it? I mean, what I think this points to is that we continue as a society to labor under this notion that that the ideal is autonomy and independence, and that's the norm. And then if something tragic comes along and rips you out of that heightened state, and that you then take on a life that's less than good, less than normal, less than right. So I have over the years figured that buried in this sort of polarized response we get from people around these subjects has to do with just some inadequate and inaccurate suppositions about what it means to be independent, about the normalcy of illness and disability and death, etc. So I think that's the major critique here, is our social order around these things and how we collude to keep these issues out of our normal daily activity. And this is part of the fallout. So we either then, once we're in those shoes, and that's in someone's face, they're left with this sense that they either have to praise us for daring to breathe another day, because it must be so horrible, and therefore you must be so amazing for just getting out of bed in the morning. So I think that's what's behind those comments. And I agree, it's a real problem. And on the receiving end, it can be so lonely making, because like you're saying, we know that we're neither Frankenstein nor Jesus. So thank you so much for that comment. Let's, as in our community here, as caregivers and as patients, let's do all we can to normalize this, to live out loud to some degree, so that people know that these aren't these distinctions are false. So, okay, thank you very, very much. Next question, Sonia. Sonia, are you there?
I was muted.
Oh, you sure were.
Okay, next question. What is happening in the palliative care arena to provide support for caregivers when people do not have that support network or resources to have paid support? Given the fact that there is so much non-paid caregiver support in the US and Canada, I would imagine that sustaining caregiving is important even from an economic perspective from government.
Mm-hmm. Yes, huge points here. So as we mentioned, there's something like 45, 50 million informal unpaid caregivers in the US. And that has dramatic, as you can imagine, those same people are trying to hold down jobs, et cetera. And so there's absenteeism, people not able to show up for work. There's this thing called presenteeism, where they do show up for work, but are not productive because they're so distracted by their chores and by their work at home. And they're not their chores at home, but that's how they can feel. But sorry, no, that the work, the good, caring, loving work that they have to do at home can be exhausting. So yeah, and there's a huge economic burden to this. There are numbers in the billions, many, many billions, on dramatic annual effects on the economy. And so, of course, rightly, why wouldn't we as a society and as a government figure out a way to ease this burden and to normalize this act? So there are those of us who are pushing on the policy front. That is true, whether it's more generous paid leave, et cetera. There are also those of us who are advocating for, there's a thing called CareCorps. I think a senator from New Mexico had suggested years ago. It's never found its way through Congress, but ways to set up basically an army of home health aides of young people, maybe in exchange for tuition to college or whatever else, would sign up for a year or two of service as a home health aide, as an attendant. We know that the lowest rung on the totem pole of caregiving, home health aides, personal care attendants, certified nursing assistant. This is a very important work, and it's really not very well honored or supported in this country. And a lot of that comes down to policy too. So these are some things at play. These are big, big forces. You make really, really important points here. So meanwhile, as we pressure our legislators, et cetera, and we advocate and vote vociferously, the other thing here is for us to organize and not wait for the government. So each of us can do this these days, setting up little organizations, pods, neighborhood, watches essentially. How do we in our neighborhood start looking out for each other and to be there for each other? It's going to be increasingly important because more and more of us are not living in the traditional family structure, and isolation is a huge issue. So finding ways to informally and casually unite and organize around novel ways to care for one another. That also needs to happen, and that's not something that any of us needs to wait for, to essentially to check on our neighbors. Then lastly would be, if you are in one of those states that gets Medicaid support here, there are ways to get in-home supportive service paid through Medicaid. But to qualify, of course, you have to meet a certain poverty level. So as often in this country, you can get help if you're extremely poor, or you can get plenty of help if you're extremely rich. It's all the folks in the middle that struggle. So yes, ongoing big, big issue. There's probably more to say about that, but let's keep moving. Sonia, back to you.
Okay, the next one is more of just a comment. This is from someone who lost her mother after a month of caregiving and said, I asked the doctor the question, when do we talk about palliative care or hospice to help? And my stepdad froze and looked at me like I was suggesting putting her down. And then the doctor jumped in and said, anytime. If she gets out of this, we can always cancel hospice.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you for sharing that example. I'm glad that's how the doctor responded, and it's telling that's how your stepdad responded. So just quickly make the point here. Remember, palliative care has nothing to do with death, and the way it structures. You can get palliative care right alongside curative and intensive care. So it's not this false choice between getting quality of life or quantity of life. So that's part of it's just a misunderstanding on your stepdad's part, that palliative care, you don't need to give up anything to get palliative care, as long as you can find a program. So that's palliative care. Hospice, a really, really important point out here is you can, with a flick of a pen, you can de-enroll from hospice, and by law, you come off the hospice benefit, and your old insurance kicks right back in. And it's literally, you sign a piece of paper and it's that easy. So the stakes are very, very low, practically speaking, to the barrier to starting hospice. It should be very, very easy. Again, you got to get over the psychological hurdles of and the baggage around the word hospice, et cetera. But just so you know, you get started and you can stop anytime and restart down the road. So thank you for that example. Sonia?
Okay, the next question. Can you say anything about what kind of trainings are useful for those who want to work in the palliative care field? I am an educator who has done home health care and volunteer work supporting families in the process.
Great. Yes, come join us. We know we have a workforce issue. The field is growing, but not nearly rapidly enough to meet the current demand, let alone the aging population. So yes, we need you. Now, it can be hard, especially from a clinical point of view. Doctor, nurse, social worker, chaplain, there are training pathways to get to palliative care. Each of those fields has a whole pathway set out for certification, et cetera. But to your point, as an educator, that's not such a clear pathway. I will say a couple different things here. So there's the field per se, but then there's this sort of allied fields. Because outside of the medical specialty of palliative care, of course, all sorts of ways to concert your activities around treating suffering and participating in one's quality of life. The arts is a good example. So one idea here would be in the abstract, think of any work, and look through any sort of lens of work and find ways to participate in caring for one another and participating in quality of life and participating in some way around meaning making and the relief of suffering. That can be a little abstract. Now, shy of that, more directly, somewhere in the middle here, one of the something on ascent here is the field, quasi field of death doulas. I think many of us are aware of birth doulas, but there is similar work that happens at the other end of life, and this is lovingly called death doulas. There are training programs that are setting up. I'm on the advisory board of a group called INELDA, INELDA, inelda.org. Look them up. But the barriers to training in that work are much lower than the health sciences per se. But it can be beautiful work and ranges from grief support to practical support on the ground, to breathing with people through their own death, to being there for the family. It's much less structured and routinized, but therefore much more open. So you might consider yourself work in the doula field. There's a lot of beauty to that. And then lastly, would be to exercise your chops as an educator and perhaps in administrative work too, because certainly any palliative care group or any hospice organization, many of them are considered around public engagement, training within their own organizations, also public education. So you might be able to exercise those good chops just by finding any palliative care program or any hospice that is hiring. So those are some thoughts. Oh, last thought, if you want to go and get more training from an academic point of view, like a master's, University of Colorado, I believe, was the first. You can get a master's in palliative care. I think University of Washington may have a program now. So there may be a way for you to look into those programs, get a master's in palliative care, but you would be, your funnel for your work would be in the education plane. I believe those master's programs have that kind of breadth. So thank you for that question, and thanks for the interest. Find a way in. We need more folks.
Okay, next question is, can one simultaneously continue a last-ditch effort treatment and qualify for in-home hospice?
Great, important question. Yes, so sort of. This is where it's really, really important that we all understand that palliative care and hospice aren't quite the same thing. So again, palliative care is the bigger piece. In palliative care, you can look, there are many definitions. The World Health Organization, their Center to Advance Palliative Care, CAPC, CAPC.org. CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, have their own definition. If you look at the definition of palliative care, I'm paraphrasing, it's essentially, within the context of serious illness, palliative care is the pursuit of quality of life and the treatment of suffering, right? No mention of death, etc. Now, hospice is a subset of palliative care that is also an insurance designation, so has much more stringent sort of tactical issues of how to qualify for hospice and what you have to give up to go on to hospice. So traditionally, to go on to hospice, you have to have 6 months or less to live, best guess by 2 physicians, and you have to be willing to give up curative intended treatments. So those are made up ways to kind of keep an inside and outside view on hospice. The feeling was in the 1980s when they put that together is they needed to put limits on it because otherwise it would be so expensive and everyone would want it. That thinking is being revisited, but we're still kind of stuck with it. So in strict answer to your question, these days, with some exceptions, you really aren't likely, you can't count on being able to consider continued treatments, curative intended treatments, or last-ditch treatments, as you mentioned here, and get hospice. You can get those treatments and qualify for palliative care, right? A huge point. Then last little detail, if you're on the policy wonk, kind of side of things, there are demonstration projects and funded pilot projects around opening the hospice benefit. So to make those lines more porous and do away with some of these designations that keep too many people out of hospice. You can keep your eye on the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services there. Hospice Action Network, HAN.org, will keeps a sort of tally of legislative efforts to kind of open the policies that affect the hospice world. Or CTAC, the Center to Transform Advanced Care, also on their advisory board, and those guys do really good work. And they have on their website, I think it's thectac.org, keep a tally of legislation that would affect policies that would affect this sort of open enrollment kind of hospice work. So stay tuned. But to circle back, biggest, most important point here is not really with hospice, but definitely with palliative care. You get full tilt intensive treatment and palliative care concurrently.
Okay. Next question. I have a question about what some of the biggest challenges you're facing with building Mettle Health.
Thank you for that question. You know, we talk about them tangentially and directly, I suppose, today in the webinar. A lot of our challenges really have to do with messaging. You know, we're just getting started. We're finding our way. But we're trying various things on for size. But as a website, you know, as an electronic, we're in the digital world, and our website is how people meet us. And as we've tried to come up with languaging on our website, we have come into this question a gazillion times of how do we message this stuff without accidentally scaring people? Because as we've talked, just even saying the word death, for example, even saying the word sickness or dependency, blah, 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 there's all these sort of psychological, rhetorical barriers to letting ourselves face these issues. And we're trying to navigate those issues right now. It came up, interestingly, it came up very recently. We've been getting a little help from a branding agency on some of our website stuff. And the two folks whom we know and trust and love who are helping us, and they really get what we're trying to do. But they said something to us in the last iteration of our website. They confessed that they would struggle to send friends a link to our site, even if they knew those friends needed to talk to us, because they were afraid that they would be, as their friends would be sending signals of giving up or somehow some sort of negative signaling by just pointing people to our website. So terrifying in a way and sad in a way, and also not surprising. Been watching this dance for many years now. Like I said earlier, we really struggle to find a way to articulate these issues without accidentally scaring people. So I'd say that's our biggest issue, and it's a related issue of marketing and getting the word out in a way that welcomes everybody and shames nobody. And doing that in a way that is also specific enough around the work we're doing. So any ideas, shout. But keep an eye on our website, and please do feedback to us what seems to be landing for you, what seems to be not. And that gold standard question, would you feel comfortable pointing a friend or a family member who's struggling to our website? And if the answer is no, I wouldn't do that for whatever reason, let us know. That can be a very organizing realization. So there you go.
Okay, next one. Can you say more about the differences and similarities between hospice and palliative care?
Well, I addressed that a couple questions ago. So again, palliative care is the big bubble. No, you can, just consider it around suffering and quality of life. And you can qualify for palliative care anytime along the way, of the course of serious illness. Serious illness is the phrase we use in the field because, what constitutes serious illness? It's a good question. All this stuff is very subjective and a little bit vague and loosey-goosey to try to sort of capture everybody. It's that framing is important though. So for example, if you're suffering from a broken arm, you're not going to really need palliative care. You may be suffering, but your arm's going to heal. What you need is a cast, and you need some pain meds, and you need some patience. So that's serious illness. Don't overthink that. If someone's dealing with illness, chronic, ongoing illness, and struggling, they're relevant to palliative care, period, end of story. The trouble really is finding palliative care programs. It's underdeveloped, underfunded, under-resourced as a field within the healthcare system. That's changing. There are some really smart, wonderful people before me working very hard on all that. So it's on ascent, it's coming. But anyway, the big point there is just about anybody dealing with chronic illness or serious illness is welcome in palliative care. To make that point even further, I've had patients that I've seen for 10, 12 years, obviously, so not hospice mentality, not at the end of life at all. Some of those patients are even in remission, but they're struggling with their identity around illness, even if they don't even have that illness anymore. They left life to go to battle with cancer. They won that battle and have to re-enter the world, and that can be really, really difficult. And those guys are palliative care patients. So just to make the point of how broad that field can be. And then again, remember, hospice is a type of palliative care subset reserved for the final months of life. And I'll say it again here too, that part of the problem that gets confusing, palliative care is not an insurance designation per se. It's a type of care, yes, and it's a field, an official subspecialty in medicine, yes, but it's not an insurance designation like hospice is. When someone says someone's on hospice, you really mean they're on the hospice benefit. So that's where it also gets a little confusing, is that hospice is defined by the insurance industry, by Medicare and the insurance industry. And that can be very confusing to people, whereas palliative care is not defined per se by the insurance industry. So anyway, there's just a reiteration. We can't make those points stridently enough. They get confusing as hell. But maybe I'll add one little more point of color on this. In the field of palliative care, and by the way, as a professional in the field is called hospice and palliative medicine. Since 2006, that is the official medical subspecialty with all this training and requirements and testing requirements, etc. So my training, I've done work in hospice, I've done work in sort of upstream palliative care. It's all the same training. It's much the same work. It's these structures that are different. That's one point. And lastly, I'll simply say here too, one of the challenges for the field is we know we're not going to be able to spit out enough subspecialists to do this work to meet the demand now or in the future. So one of the things that's happening in palliative care, and this gets at someone's question earlier about being an educator here, is what we're trying to do in so many ways, palliative care is just good healthcare, is good care. We should expect even our healthcare system to care about our suffering, our experience of illness. We should expect the health system to be concerted around our families, the impact on our families as well. But the truth is we can't rely on our health system to do that just yet. So we need this subspecialty to kind of reorient the rest of healthcare back to its fundamental basic responsibilities. So in some ways, the most important patient in palliative care is the healthcare system itself. And so one of the ways you see that play out is a lot of us in the field are trying to open and develop this thing called primary palliative care, which is you don't have to be a subspecialist to do this work on some level. You don't have to get all this extra training. You have to have time and some skills around communication and caring and eking out someone's pain and suffering and tending to it and not running away, etc. But it's pretty basic stuff on some level. So we're trying to drive palliative care training deeper into medical school curricula, nursing schools, social work, chaplaincy curricula, so that in the future, the hope would be that any doctor that you've come across or nurse who's been trained in the last however many years, you can expect them to have some basic facility around palliative care principles. And we call that primary palliative care, where we don't need the specialist to come in and save the day. That's happening. It's a slow boat. We'll see how far we can go, but that's happening too. So anyway, there's a little bit more detail on this big question. Anyway, I should stop there. Sonia, are there more?
Yeah, we've got a few more questions here. So the next one is, how and when does a caregiver become a patient advocate?
Well, you could say a pat answer, a simple answer would be like day one. You're always going to be kind of navigating, though. You're concerting, you're linking your own efforts and your own pride and well-being, your own sense of self, to the well-being of another person, and that's almost inherently sort of an advocate's position, certainly an empathetic one. But I'm going to try to get a little bit more specific, really. So yeah, always, but functionally, practically speaking, it becomes really important to see yourself as an advocate when your person is struggling to be able to communicate. All the illness, the later stages in particular, can get us to a point as a patient where we're not really able to faithfully track what's going on, make sound decisions for ourselves, synthesize and collate all this information. And at some points, we start losing capacity. And that's a legal term, but essentially at some point, we start to lose the ability to advocate for ourselves. And so when that becomes the situation for your person, then you really do explicitly need to advocate, quite explicitly and directly. Then you really are speaking on behalf of your person. So that's another answer to your question. So it's a little bit all the time, but very specifically when your person is really losing their own faculties and the capacity to speak for themselves.
Okay, and our last question here is, how do we advocate within a monolithic system that seems hell-bent on stripping us of all agency?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's not funny. I laugh just because you make such a good point, and it's so darn frustrating, and it feels like the work of many lifetimes to somehow get this darn wonderful, horrible healthcare system to do what it wants to do. I mean, one of the things you realize, I imagine that people go into the health professions, generally speaking, because they really care. And they're filled with love. Can be very smart. And they go into great debt, and they sacrifice years of training and let go of other interests, all for the privilege of caring for their fellow human beings. But unfortunately, the system itself in which we labor accidentally, and I do think it's accidental, ends up cutting us off at the knees. And that's how we all burn out, by the way. That's the nature of burnout in the health professions. We don't generally burn out because illness exists. We burn out because we're not able to deliver the care that we are trained and know how to deliver, that we are unnaturally hamstrung. So just to sort of, I mentioned that to kind of get clear on, it's really important to distinguish the providers of healthcare and the limitations you may feel from them from the systems issues. And for the most part, there really are systems issues. The system was just poorly designed, if it ever was designed. It's really duct tape and toothpick together. And if it was ever designed, it was designed around diseases, not people. And that was a fundamental design flaw that set up about 100 years ago or so. So policy issues to kind of change all this, but meanwhile, for your own sanity's sake, and also to get the kind of care that you need, is to remember, I would encourage you to have all sorts of compassion for the people toiling within the healthcare system, even though you may be justly very angry for inadequate care when that person just couldn't even answer a question or didn't look at you in the eye or didn't call you back. For everybody's sake, I would suggest you see that as the problem's really the fault of the system more than of the person. And that'll get you in a position that's accurate, and also prevent you from accidentally shooting the messenger, and even finding some compassion for people trying so hard to labor in the system. That just is a more functional place from which to navigate, and a kinder place, because part of the caregiving burden means you can just get layered up with resentments, and it can become embittered, and that's not a state I think any of us wants to be in. It doesn't serve you. So anyway, those are some distinctions that I think are important. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but there's some thoughts.
All right, I think that's all of them. Thanks, BJ, for answering everything. And thank you, everyone watching and who attended and who were okay waiting to get their answer. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, guys. And I really appreciate everyone participating so heartfully. I feel a nice, sweet little community bubbling up together here. And so thank you, guys. See you next month.